Very happy for being able to introduce Rebecca Giblin from Australia, who's been now coming from Glasgow, I understand, and who's going to explain a huge research project she's been embarking on for the next 4 years, I understand, and that looks at ways to sort of, essentially ensure authors' payments are proper, taking account of culture within the copyright context. And I think it also sort of is based somewhat on a project which you had embarked before in terms of sort of reimagining copyright and rethinking perhaps without the constraints of an existing international framework, which we tend to have to deal with, how copyright law could be if one could completely redraft it. So we'll be happy to hear from you how that next project is going to look like. Thank you.
Thanks, Henny. Hi everyone, so happy to be here in Cambridge. It's actually my first time in Cambridge. I'm not sure how it's come about that I haven't been here, but here I am. And as Henning said, I'm going to be speaking today about some of the ideas underlying this new author's interest project that I'm going to be spending most of my time on for the next 4 years. And what I want to do today is explore some of the possibilities that we might be able to open up if we actually took authors' interests seriously. Not only for getting them paid, but also reclaiming some of the lost culture that is forsaken under current approaches. When Samuel Clemens testified to the US Congress in 1906 in favor of longer copyrights, you might expect that he based his claim in the value of books. But in fact, he based his claim in the utter lack of value of books. Because at that time, almost all books were dead and lost within about 10 years. And only maybe 1 in 1,000, Clemens said, survived the existing term of 42 years. And so when copyrights expired, what happened was that those few valuable books continued to be sold, and the valueless continued not to be. The only difference was in what happened to the profits. When the copyright expired, the publishers of those few valuable books got to get the whole thing instead of having to share it with authors or their heirs. And so in these circumstances, Clemens's argument was that there was no downside to the automatic grant of really long terms to every single work, because that would enable authors to reap the benefits from those few that did have lasting value, and the rest were going to be lost to obscurity anyway. And the reason I start with this story is because it encapsulates the two core problems that I really want to focus on today. The first is that things change. In 1906, high marginal costs of copying and distribution did mean that most works had to be quickly lost. Only the most popular or valuable could be made enduringly available. Since then, of course, we've had a revolution that has driven these costs for many kinds of works down to virtually nothing. So now the automatic grant of really long terms does have a downside. Now that causes books to be lost only for the reason that the copyright has outlasted its owner's interest. And second, that things don't change at all. Despite the efforts of Hugo and Dickens and Clemens and all the rest, despite authors being at the forefront of the rhetoric for broader and longer rights for generations now, copyright still does a really poor job of actually getting them paid. And that's not just problematic, I think, on considerations of fairness and equity, but the fact that authors get so little, I think, is making it difficult for us to entertain proposals that might conceivably see them get still less. So we can't have sensible conversations about exceptions, for example, until this gets sorted. And so I think that this is an under-recognized barrier to meaningful reform. So here we have several problems. That existing approaches to copyright do a poor job of getting authors paid, that they do a poor job of keeping works available. And in thinking about solutions to this, of course, we've got some hard limits on what we can do in response. because of various international treaty obligations. And here what I'm primarily focused on are Berne and TRIPS. Henning raised earlier the free trade agreement requirements that can be and are increasingly being TRIPS++. Those I'm not so concerned with because there is some prospect of amendability in the future, but Berne and TRIPS we're inextricably locked into, and the prospects of changing them are just vanishingly small. And so the kinds of limits that they impose on decision-making in the copyright space include the minimum terms for works of author's life plus 50, the prohibition on formalities on use and enjoyment, or exercise and enjoyment of rights, and various other things as well. So tonight what I'm planning to do is to try and weave a path through the gaps and the flexibilities that are left to us within this treaty framework and see if we can come up with an alternative that might make a real difference not only to authors' remuneration, but as I said, simultaneously help us reclaim lost cultural value. And the key, as I said, lies in taking seriously the author's interest. But first we have to figure out what that actually is, because this concept, I think, is one of the most misunderstood and misused in all of copyright. Copyright's ultimately about both incentives and rewards. Society is motivated to incentivize initial cultural production. It's also interested in ensuring ongoing availability once, through investment in works once they've been created in the first place. And crucially, though, these are not aims in and of themselves. We award these incentives in order to achieve those broader social goals or the broader social benefits that come from widespread access to knowledge and culture. And then on top of that, we're also motivated to recognize and reward creators for their contributions, whether it's of personality or labor or whatever theory that you want to do to explain this instinct that we have to give rewards. And that's why even if creators would be willing to make works for relatively small incentives, or indeed no incentive whatsoever, that doesn't mean that's where the grant of rights should end. Now, our international treaty frameworks and domestic laws worldwide are, of course, a pastiche of both rationales. Similarly, the discourse mixes together incentives and rewards motivations until they're inextricably mixed. So you can think of the red bit as the incentives component of copyright and the blue bit as the rewards part. What I think we tend to do is we just mix them together and we don't separate them out. They end up being effectively merged. But we need to distinguish between them because they are different. Crucially, we don't mind who gets the incentives bit of copyright, because what we're interested in here is getting the works produced and available. But we are interested in who gets the rewards bit, because that's justified only as being for the benefit of the person who actually created the work. And none of this is at all to say that cultural investors are not valid and important, or that they're not themselves very often having a difficult time making a profit in the current environment. It's simply to say that investors' interests and authors' interests are different and need to be satisfied in different ways. So to understand and think through the author's interest, we have to demerge incentives and rewards. So we need to conceptually separate out the red bit, the incentive component, which can go to anyone, from that blue bit, the rewards component, that's justifiable as being only for the author. And that's what the orthogonalisation in this title's talk is all about. In separating out these components, I'm really calling for copyright to be orthogonalised. And orthogonalisation, any mathematicians in the room? Good. Orthogonalisation is a mathematical process which I'm going to explain to you by analogy to an unintuitively designed car. Imagine this is your car and it's operated by two levers. When you push this lever forward 10 degrees, the car accelerates by 2 kilometers an hour and turns 3 degrees left. And when you pull this lever forward, the car decelerates 7 kilometers an hour and turns 4 degrees, 7 degrees right. Now, you can drive this car through careful maneuvering of the levers, right? But it's not easy. Faced with this kind of problem in mathematics, practitioners seek to orthogonalize the axes in such a way that moving one lever is not going to have an effect on any others. And that would help our vehicle go forwards and backwards without moving from side to side and be much easier to drive. And I see copyright as being in need of a bit more orthogonalization. We want to incentivize initial creation and ongoing availability of works, and we want to reward authors. But when we conceptually combine incentives and rewards, I think it's a bit like driving that really tricky car. We make a policy change that gives more reward to some creators while taking away some incentives and reducing the overall creation of new works, and then another one that takes away some of those rewards and results in less creation of one kind of work and more of one kind of another. And at the same time, we're really to make the ride even more hair-raising, we're really lacking much of an empirical evidence base to let us know what these changes are actually doing in practice. So we're moving forwards and backwards and side to side on these different axes all at the same time. And what I argue is that making stronger conceptual delineations between incentives and rewards would help us better understand and predict the effects of our policy levers before we pull them in any given direction. Now, of course, we're never going to be able to perfectly orthogonalize our axes. There's a lot of issues in play with copyright, but my argument is we can do a great deal to straighten them up. All right, so we're starting from this conceptual delineation between incentives and rewards, and now I want us to think about how we might satisfy these aims. The full analysis is in this book. Henning mentioned, What If We Could Reimagine Copyright? If you want to check it out, we publish it open access and you can download it for free, so do read it and tell all of your friends. So just briefly though, let's have a look at our aims. Separated out or orthogonalized from rewards, incentivizing the initial creation of a work is a purely economic aim. So what do we need to award by way of copyright in order to incentivize a work's initial creation? Well, there's a lot of empirical work that's being done and various industry models that can help us figure this out with quite a lot of specificity. But for our purposes tonight, the concept of the time value of money is enough to get us in the ballpark. So I want you to imagine that you're an author deciding whether or not you want to invest your time and your other resources in writing a book. Or better still, you're a publisher deciding whether to invest in printing it. One thing that we want to know is how motivated you would be by the prospect of copyright earnings that you're going to receive next year, 10 years from now, 40 years, 100 years down the track. Because the time value of money recognizes that the further away in time a benefit will be received, the less it will affect you right now. Right, and we all know that, right? Imagine you're interviewing potential housemates, right? And one of them says, yes, I'll pay monthly upfront. And the other one says, well, I'll pay you in a lump sum 30 years from now. Who are you going to... Obviously, in terms of the effect on your present day decision making, you're much more interested in that money now. It's worth more to you. And this is something that can easily be modeled. And we need to do that because what we're interested in is the present value of those potential earnings at the time the work is created. And we can figure that out by discounting them with reference to the applicable interest rate. Now, the results, of course, depend on the assumptions you use, your interest rate. But this is one example that came from a group of eminent economists put together in the Eldred Brief in the litigation over the US term extension. And assuming a real interest rate of 7%, they showed that $1 today is worth 93 cents if it's received in a year, and then just tiny fractions of a cent once you shift the time horizon out further. I've converted it to pounds so that you feel at home. Now, in reality, very few works actually maintain or grow their revenues over time like this. So this is assuming that the revenues received are fixed. What usually happens for books, music, film, the vast majority of the commercial revenues are extracted within a very few short years, right? But even, and we call that cultural depreciation, but even if a work was to maintain its revenues across the entire time, this time value of money shows us that the prospect of those later earnings might still have very little impact on present day decision making. And in fact, based on these assumptions, the prospect of £10,000 in 100 years is worth £12 to you today. All right, so it's the same value as just going down King Street, having a burger and a pint. So that's how much it's likely, that prospect of £10,000 in a century is likely to affect you today. Now, in terms of what this tells us about how long copyright needs to be in order to incentivize creation, Landis and Posner draw the line at about 25 years. So if you're that publisher deciding whether to publish the book, you might well react to those economic incentives for about the first 25 years. But the prospect of earnings 35 years, 45 years down the track are going to do very little to influence your decision today about whether to make those investments. So on the basis of time value of money alone, 25 years looks ample to incentivize even the most lavish investments. Now, other incentive aims are sometimes used to justify awards of copyright in excess of the incentive amount. So, for example, you'll often hear publishers argue that they invest those windfall profits into producing more works that they wouldn't otherwise have taken a chance on. But I go through the analysis in the book. It looks like those above incentive windfalls translate poorly into works that wouldn't otherwise have been created. In other words, let me put it a little bit better. There's really little evidence to show that translates into works that would not have been funded anyway. So the actual impact of those above incentive rights seems small. Investors also argue that longer rights are necessary to incentivize them to continue making works available, which, as I explained, is one of our main aims as a society. We want to ensure those investments. Here, however, the empirical evidence very strongly shows that rather than having a positive impact on availability, long terms tend to actually make works less available. And this chart is from Professor Paul Hill's study into the availability of books on Amazon. You can see that availability drops shortly after release, and then there's a big spike in availability as works enter the public domain. Right, in fact, there were more books available from the 1880s on Amazon than from the 1980s. And there's lots of other studies that I've reviewed in the book too that overwhelmingly show the same kind of results. We can also see how long terms have failed to achieve their availability aims when we look at the problem of orphan works. So what all of this tells us is that even combined, our incentives rationales don't really support a term of above about 25 years. So after that, copyright can really only be justified on its rewards rationales. So it's authors' personal rights to rewards that overwhelmingly supports claims to above incentive rights. And those claims have power. That's why the rhetoric in favor of broader and longer copyrights and against exceptions invariably puts authors at the forefront. That's why you rarely hear claims grounded in the rights of investors to maximize their profits. Authors' interests are put in service to investors' interests because their validity and power make them effective. But all too often, most or all of that rewards component ends up being captured by others in the cultural value chain. Rational intermediaries don't limit themselves to the minimum necessary to secure their investments. They take everything they can get, to the point where this standard form Hollywood clause requires authors to sign over not just their entire rights in perpetuity, but throughout the universe at large. So if a lucrative extraterrestrial licensing market emerges, it's not going to be the scriptwriters who get rich. On this planet, I continually see investors having signed over to themselves the whole or the lion's share of the copyright. As cultural economists like Professor Richthouse have demonstrated, the ability of investors to routinely take all or most of a copyright is not a simple problem of education or information. It's a consequence of the structural design and competitive realities of creative labour markets. And those realities aren't new. I recently came across this draft bill recognising that authors are sometimes obliged, out of necessity, to assign their full interests before they know what their works are worth. Where was it drafted, Lionel? Not asking you because you know this one. It's from your website anyway. 1737. We've been talking about this stuff for a really long time. And somehow we still have not yet adequately addressed these inequalities. They remain baked into our copyright structures, which after all are designed around protecting the interests of owners, not authors. And that's problematic because, while of course there often is some alignment between the interests of authors and the interests of investors, they can and do also diverge. And I want to illustrate that with data that I've pulled from one of my other current projects, which is a multinational investigation into e-lending practice in libraries. And what we're looking at here is the Pulitzer Prize winners from 25 years ago for the last 10 years and their availability for e-lending in the United States and Australia. So there's two things in these data I particularly want to point out. First of all, you can see that even winners of the Pulitzer Prize for fiction are not necessarily being exploited in libraries. We can see here 20% of the books are not available in the United States and 40% are not available for e-lending in Australia on any terms whatsoever. But second, I want you to have a look at the licensing and pricing data. Although these books are 25 years old and more, they're still priced like frontlist titles. And remember, we've talked about cultural depreciation and how the markets for books really drop off very rapidly. In the US, what we see, you see this one copy, one user license very often. That's a perpetual license, which allows libraries to hold the books in their collection for as long as they have a contract with the platform, and to lend it out to one user at a time for that period. In Australia, you see we don't have any examples of one copy, one user. What we get offered, I call them, usually it's an exploding license. So very often it's got a number of loans and a period of time, and whichever comes first will result in the book being deleted from the collection. And so I've also put here the physical price for comparison, so you can see how much it would cost a library to just purchase the paperback. And if we just look at Updike's Rabbit at Rest, we can see what happens is that an Australian library could buy the paperback for $10, or they could license it for $28, and it will be deleted from their collection in 2 years, even if nobody borrowed it once. And our research shows, I don't think it'll be a surprise to anyone, that this kind of pricing and licensing strategy can deter libraries from adding certain books to their collections at all. But what I really want to show you from this, or get you to understand from this, is how investors' interests can diverge from authors' interests. publishers are rationally interested in maximising their overall share of libraries' collections budgets, not interested in maximising the income of any particular author. And they also don't have any interest in a particular book continuing to be read, which might well be an interest of an author. So it's probably perfectly rational for publishers to price their back catalogue prohibitively, knowing that fewer books will be sold, but that their overall profit will be larger. But those strategies can mean less income for individual authors than they might otherwise be able to obtain. So what I think we have here is a situation where, although above incentive terms are justified as being in recognition of authors' moral claims, they're overwhelmingly being captured by others. And as we've just seen, often those rights can be exercised in ways that drive down the author's share even further. Investors taking long grants can cause other problems as well. It results in a concentration of rights that causes oligopolies, that really perpetuates copyright's oligopoly problem. And then that makes it more difficult for new distribution models to emerge. And for that reason, further entrenches those poor remuneration outcomes for authors. And really importantly as well, that routine locking up of rights by investors, even though only the tiniest fraction of them will ever actually be exploited, causes culture to be lost, and therefore directly undermines the other reasons we had for awarding the copyright in the first place. So let's be clear about what we're doing here. Current approaches prioritize investors' interests over both authors' valid claims to rewards and society's interest in access to knowledge and culture. We're giving away a lot, and we're getting very little of what we wanted in return. So, how might we recalibrate copyright within the constraints of the treaty framework to do a better job? So recall again the problems that we want to solve. The first thing we want to do is get creators paid. And in this regard, as we've seen, one of the big problems for authors is that the rewards component of copyright is largely captured by others. One thing we could do, and that's already being done in some jurisdictions, albeit a little bit differently, is limit what authors can give away in the first place. We've seen that 25 years of exclusivity is enough to incentivize even the most expensive investments. So that's enough to satisfy the investor's interest. So what if transfers were limited to a maximum of 25 years, after which they automatically return to authors? This would need to be supported, of course, by some additional protections to ensure that it wasn't subverted, such as a rule making void any requirement that authors sign over all of their future blocks of 25 years, which has been a problem with past reversion systems. We don't want to end up with a situation where publishers publishers are going to take everything that they can get, right? That's the rational choice. So there needs to be protections to limit how much that actually is. We'd also want to avoid situations where investors were disincentivized from further investment by a too short remaining period on their contract. So imagine, for example, a book publisher has entered into a contract with an author to exploit their book for a maximum of 25 years. And in year 24 of that contract, a film adaptation of the book comes out. That's a terrific opportunity to market the book to a new audience, but the publisher might be reluctant to make those investments, knowing that they've only got a very short period remaining on the contract. And that would not be a problem here, because while the author would need to be restricted from granting more than 25 years exclusivity at any one time, there's no reason why they shouldn't be able to terminate a contract, enter into, by mutual agreement, enter into a new agreement, this time with much better knowledge about what the work is actually worth. authors who held reverted rights under this sort of reimagined system could exploit them however they wished, including by just licensing right back to the same intermediary. But it might well be infeasible for a traditional publisher to continue to market the work because their cost structures might mean the expected revenues just aren't worth it. An alternative investor, though, with a different model, perhaps based on some combination of digital sale, print on demand, library licensing, could well be able to generate some income with relatively low overheads. And while that income might not be significant to the traditional publisher, it may well be to the individual author. And taking the author's interest seriously by better securing to them the rewards component of the copyright, actually, you can start to see, helps us with our second problem as well. The problem of wanting to keep the works available. Because if we were to have wholesale reversion of rights, that would free them up to the possibility of fresh exploitations. But we would need to be really careful that an automatic reversion system didn't actually worsen the problems of orphaning and neglect. And that's one of the major criticisms of automatic reversion, is that people can end up with rights without even realizing it, or perhaps without any further interest in exploiting them. And the difference is, instead of having, X number of neglectful owners, when we have the concentration of rights, we have 1 million times more, right? It's splintering it further and making the problem even worse. So if any kind of automatic reversion system was to work, we'd need to have an ownership registry to facilitate rights clearance and a catch-all for dealing with works in which authors had no further interest. And here we run into a bit of trouble. There's no treaty obstacle to reversion itself because Byrne and Trips are silent about ownership of rights. But they do, as I mentioned, prohibit formalities on the exercise and enjoyment of rights. That's not quite as constraining as it's sometimes treated as being, because like I said, no regulation of ownership here, and as a result of that, Byrne and Trips do permit formalities on ownership transfer. So a nation could provide that transfers would be void unless registered by the assignee. And we can see that an appropriately low-cost registration system wouldn't be onerous, given that almost all jurisdictions already require that transfers and the grants of exclusive rights be evidenced in writing. So we could get a Byrne-compatible registry for all transferred works, which would go a long way towards facilitating the clearance of rights. But this would still only provide a partial solution. Even if we had that kind of registry on transfer, we might not be able to find even all of those authors because the registry could be up to 25 years out of date by the time the rights actually revert. And while we could certainly encourage authors to keep their details up to date, sort of emails like you get with a domain name renewal or things like that, that might not be so much help given how many works we know are already orphaned very quickly under the existing system. And really crucially, it wouldn't help us at all with that multitude of works, that far greater number of works, which are never transferred and thus fall outside our Byrne permissible registry power. And these are the works that tend to be lost at even higher rates. I mean, it's things like local maps and pictures of a town over time, ephemera like concert tickets, protest posters, and obscure self-published books. Right? These, yes, that is the absolute dodgiest self-published book cover I could find on the internet, and I spent much longer than I should have looking. This presents a classic collective action problem because individually the overwhelming majority of copyrighted works are not worth enough to their owners to exploit them. But collectively, the lost value to society is really enormous. And so here's another way of looking at our two problems. First, we can't seem to find a way of getting authors paid. Second, we've got all this money being left on the table from copyrights that outlast their owner's interest. And when I started thinking about this, it really evoked in me Victor Hugo's idea of the domaine public payant, which he most famously raised in this speech in 1878. This was the idea of a paid public domain, so that when copyright ends, the works continue to be paid for. And again, it's really important to understand this idea in the context of the time when it was made. 1878, it's very similar to the kind of conditions that were operating when Clemens was making his testimony. Right? We've got copyrights expiring, a few valuable books continuing to be published, but the publishers now being the only ones to reap the money. Right? And like Clemens, Hugo didn't think that the expiry of the copyright was reason why the publisher should get the whole of the pie. But what he did think should happen was really interesting, because he wasn't particularly interested in supporting the author's heirs of the blood. He thought that those revenues should go towards supporting authors' heirs of the spirit, emerging writers who needed support to write new books. And today, I think the problem we're confronting is in essence the same. What should we do with these still valuable works when the author no longer has an interest? Well, what if we were to introduce not a paid public domain, but a kind of author's domain? A stewardship arrangement whereby works that were of no further interest to their individual authors could be opened up for use, and the revenues invested into direct support of authorship through things like grants and fellowships and prizes. A steward could have a dual mission of generating revenues while also promoting widespread availability and access. So it could really open up some interesting possibilities for licensing. It might be, for example, that you could know in advance, if you're an electronic musician, that if you sampled from works in this collection, that there would be a fixed formula for the kind of payment that you would make, and you would not be able to be held hostage after you made a song that ended up incorporating a work. So if we introduce something like this, it could be that we could address both of our core problems with the one solving the other, getting creators paid by reclaiming currently wasted cultural value. But how can we achieve this in a Berne-compliant way? Well, significantly, Berne minima only apply to foreign authors, not domestic ones. So if a work is first published in a particular country, that country can introduce things such as previously or otherwise impermissible formalities. And the conventional wisdom has long been that a country would rarely wish to do so. The assumption is that Berne's minimums provide better treatment for authors, and therefore departing from them necessarily means discriminating against domestic authors compared to their foreign counterparts. But I think it's high time that we started to challenge that assumption. The prohibition on formalities was decided for very good reasons, the exact same year that the first Model Ts started rolling off Ford's production line. At that time, formalities were expensive and were onerous and were very often causing authors to unfairly lose their rights. Obviously, times have changed. Registration has become routine to the point where we do it probably daily, sometimes several times a day, for all kinds of things, and perhaps without even noticing. And at the same time, we can see that formality-free copyrights are actually contributing to authors losing their rights. So, yes, indeed, political considerations would usually prevent a nation from giving worse treatment to its own authors. But what if we've reached a point where departing from Berne could mean our authors overall got a better deal? In those circumstances, a nation could decide that it was time to adopt a new copyright bargain that asked authors to take on some minor new obligations in exchange for a much bigger share of the rewards. All right, so that's been a lot of ideas. I have tried to put it all together for you in this handy flowchart. So let me just talk it through briefly to show what a Berne-compatible copyright law of the nature I've been talking about here might look like. So let's start with the treatment of domestic works after a work has been created. Where they've been the subject of an ownership transfer, we could limit the grant to, say, a maximum of 25 years and require it to be registered. Then, once the transfer expires, we could ask the author to indicate, again by registration, whether they've still got an interest in the work. For works that have never been transferred, we might do the same thing, again after maybe 25 years or so. The register that would be created as a result of this would really facilitate rights clearance by providing more up-to-date ownership info. And then works that are not registered could go into this domaine d'auteur. And revenues from licensing, if they remained unclaimed by the original author, could then be delivered to cultural organisations in order to directly fund authorship and the creation of new works. I'd propose that authors would be able to reclaim their works by registration at any time. So if, for example, a work found a new audience because of its inclusion in the author's domain, the author could put up their hand and say, oh, actually that's mine and I am interested in that, and continue from there. For foreign works, though, we can see that the scope for change is narrower. Again, where they have been the subject of transfer, we can limit the grant and require that it be registered. And after that, it could again revert to the author. But we can't require foreign authors to register their interest. We could just design technical systems to strongly encourage them to do so. And for those works that aren't transferred, which is the vast majority of works, we can't require registration at all. So we need to obviously combine this sort of system with appropriate mechanisms for dealing with orphan works in much the same way as we need to under current approaches. So how might we expect this to work compared to the way things work now? Well, it seems likely that it would secure a lot more of copyright's rewards to authors directly from the chance to re-exploit reverted rights and indirectly via revenues generated through the author's domain. And that in turn would provide them with fresh capital which could be used to directly create more works, furthering our incentive aim. And as well as getting authors paid, I would expect that it would do a great deal to help with our availability problems, because nations could at least reclaim their lost domestic culture, which is probably what they're going to be most interested in anyway. If we did engage in this kind of wholesale reversion, we would reduce oligopoly power and we would support the emergence of new business models. Registries would facilitate rights clearance, and I think you could even use those registries to facilitate more direct licensing. So for example, when an author registers their interest, there could be a little box that pops up that says, would you like to license this to libraries in exchange for this much money per loan? You know, and then that could all be connected and facilitate those uses. And another thing is, I suspect that this could clear those blockages I talked about elsewhere in the system, because if we had a copyright law that actually focused on getting authors paid, we might be able to have more sensible conversations about non-remunerated exceptions as well that weren't going to interfere with paid markets for works. Those conversations which now are simply impossible. But there is the possibility of us running aground on one more reef, which some of you might have noticed.
I don't know, national treatment might be this year.
Yeah, let's talk about national treatment in the questions, but because that is a really interesting one. But let's first think about territoriality. Yeah. Under Berne, a work's country of origin is the union country where it's first published. And that's long been easy to manipulate, right? As we saw from the ease with which US authors took the back door into Berne. And of course, in the age of the internet, it's trivial. So if any country was to mandate a seriously author protective scheme, whether it's this one or any other, opportunistic investors would no doubt seek to bypass it by first publishing in another jurisdiction and therefore manipulating the country of first publication. If investors simply published in country B instead of country A, would that force country A to treat its own nationals' works as foreign works? If that is so, it would seriously limit country A's ability to introduce the broader registration requirements that would support rights clearance and would provide the catch-all that would fund and make this whole thing workable. So have I been telling you all of this for nothing? Well, here I think it starts to get really, really interesting because it's not that simple. We don't know exactly how these provisions would operate today, but the actual text is very, very interesting. Article 3.4 tells us that a work will be considered as having been published simultaneously in several countries if it's published in 2 or more within 30 days of first publication. And if we go back again to 5.4, we can see that in full, it says that the country of origin is in where it's been first published in the country of the Union, that country, but where works have been published simultaneously in several countries of the Union which grant different terms of protection, it's the country with the shortest term. And Berne, of course, mandates a minimum of life plus 50. But now think about the publication of a work in our current globalized online world, right? Given the growing use of online publication and print on demand, and the way in which works are released and spread very quickly around the world. Given the 30-day rule, a work might well be published simultaneously in every major market. Perhaps 50 countries will have the shortest term of life plus 50. A plain English reading of this suggests that perhaps all 50 will be the country of origin. And the consequences of that are mind-blowing. That means all 50 of those countries could depart from Berne minima for those works. If we had downward harmonization of terms so that everyone was life plus 50, maybe every country could depart from Berne minima for those works. Now, in light of all this, Ginsburg and Ricketson have suggested, well, hang on a minute. That can't be right. So maybe it might make sense to have a reading that designates the country of the author's nationality as the country of origin, despite what the text says. Because after all, Berne was only intended to regulate relations between nations and foreign authors, not nations and their own authors. So we can't know for sure what legal meaning Article 5 would have today until it's tested, but it's certainly arguable that it's not as gameable as it might appear. And it's also, I think, worth mentioning what would be involved in challenging a country's application of author protective mechanisms to its own nationals. Because we talk a lot about the teeth that TRIPS brings Berne, but not so much about the limits. Let's say country A was to enact the kind of author protective copyright law that I've sketched out today. I'm a national of country A. I enter into a contract with a publisher to publish the book there. The first publication happens to be in country B, which doesn't have these author protections. And then after 30 days, it comes out in my own country. And country A applies its law regardless. We've already seen that it arguably has the right to do so under the Ginsburg and Ricketson interpretation of Article 5. But now let's think about what would be involved in actually challenging it. That would require country B to bring a claim in the WTO against country A, claiming that it had breached its TRIPS obligations in a way that impaired the benefits country B expected to get from the treaty. I know that when TRIPS was first enacted, we were very worried that there would be an avalanche of litigation. But in fact, in the 20 plus years it's been running, we've seen very few claims initiated under TRIPS, even where breach and damage have been clear. And a claim here, I think, would seem particularly unlikely, We're talking about a challenge of a country's application of author protective mechanisms to their own nationals, mechanisms that by supporting authors and enabling fresh exploitations directly support the aims of both Byrne and Trips. And any such claimant would be on the wrong side of those powerful author-favouring rhetoric that we've talked a little bit about. And not only that, but they would be risking the possibility of a decision confirming that in fact the country of origin principle does apply as written, with the result that all works have dozens or maybe eventually hundreds of countries of origin. In light of all this, I think the prospects of any challenge seems vanishingly unlikely. So any single nation, I think, could apply the rules I've talked about here to its own nationals. But still, that does only take us so far because copyright is territorial. We could only achieve it within the borders of a country that enacted this kind of rule. So how could we take it further? Well, I'm going to finish with something even more unlikely than what I've been talking about so far. But still intriguing. The possibility of a new international agreement. Now, Article 20 of Byrne prohibits countries from coming up with any subsequent international agreements with contrary provisions. But there is no Article 20 problem if multiple countries get together and agree to introduce these Byrne departing norms each for their own nationals, since that's not contrary to Byrne. So just as there's a backdoor into Byrne, so too there's a front door out. And so, okay, admittedly quite radical, the idea of a new author-focused international instrument that incorporates elements of domestic Byrne departure. But if in the world we live in today, that's the only way to get authors paid and reclaim currently lost value, and to move past that constant refrain of, oh, but Byrne doesn't let us do that, that plagues copyright policy debates, maybe it's worth considering. All right, so very nice story, but so far it's just a bunch of hypotheses that I've put together with some pretty pictures. How could we figure out whether something like this could actually work? And that is what I'm going to be spending my time on for the next 4 years with various collaborators, as well as doctrinal work exploring things like Article 5. We're going to be doing some empirical testing in the context of the trade book industry, investigating things like how are older books being distributed in the current practice, what kinds of investments are publishers making, how are revenues from those works being split with authors, what are the impacts of existing reversion laws on availability of works and on authors' remuneration, and trying to understand what, based on various assumptions, what kind of revenues an author's domain might be expected to generate. So generally, as you can see, the idea is to get a better idea of what current approaches to copyright are causing authors and broader society to lose. So that's all the program for the future. I just want to finish now with one thought of something we can actually do right now. Too often, I think we allow reform debates to hyper-focus on should we have more or less copyright, not so much on what we actually need to do to achieve its aims. And regardless of what you think of this particular vision that I've sketched out tonight, I hope that I have at least shown the potential that we have to solve a lot of copyright problems by engaging in a bit of orthogonalisation and a clearer demarcation of its incentives and rewards aims. And so I would encourage all of us listening to think about that delineation when thinking about copyright, whether it's in a classroom setting or contributions to reform, because if we stop allowing authors' valid claims to reward to be co-opted in order to further other economic interests, if we focus on what copyright is actually supposed to achieve, I think that we could find that a pathway to greater accountability and much more productive debates. Thank you.